Hello, this is how to program with the Blazor component from DevExpress Grid. This is how it looks like. This is the demo application. There's a web-based version of the demo application. After you install the DevExpress Blazor components on your Windows machine, you will have in the Start menu the DevExpress Demo Center. From here you select Blazor, and then you select Grid. A web site will be started, a web application. And this is the version of the DevExpress Blazor demo application running as a web app installed on my local Windows computer. There's the grid, which is the newer control, and then there's the data grid, which is the legacy control. They're very similar. DX data grid is legacy, and the new one is DxGrid. So, as usual with DevExpress data grids, there are such data grids for all of the platforms on which the DevExpress controls run, such as Delphi, System Windows Forms, .NET Framework, ASP.NET, MVC, ASP.NET Core Blazor, etc. They allow you to present as a table, for instance, the result of an SQL query, a list of objects of the same type. And then there's features such as you can sort by columns, you can group by columns, there's search, there's pagination, virtual loading, such that in the case the list that needs to be displayed is huge, you're not doing a ton of network transfer and not using a ton of RAM by keeping all of the data in memory. This is the paginator. You can select the size. There's 3 predefined sizes, small, medium, and large, which specify the size of the fonts, mainly in the grid. You can have columns which represent a property on an object from a list of objects, or a column from an SQL query which is loaded via Entity Framework Core. Or you can have computed columns. You can format the data that you fetch from the model in various ways. You can sort by more than one column. There's a group row. Which allows you to group by one of the columns. Grid inside grid. You can edit the data. For instance, let's select the penultimate row and click the edit button. We have an edit form for the current row. We can cancel or save. And if we don't like the form editor for the current row to be shown immediately below the row, we can use pop-up edit forms, which look like this, look like a modal dialog. There's additional types of editing a row. We can edit in line. We can have input validation. We can change the captions of the labels in the edit form. These are the three types of editing. So we can use edit row, edit cell, and the two which we saw previously, edit form and pop-up edit form. There's a filter row. There's a search box which searches in all of the columns, in all of the cells at once. Various ways of filtering, sorting, searching. Column cells and labels and we'll be back looking at the demo applications. First of all, let's look at what we have when we use Visual Studio, Microsoft Visual Studio, the latest version 2022, and we want to create a new project. We have this wizard provided by DevExpress. Inside Microsoft Visual Studio 2022, we're creating a new solution and project using the DevExpress Blazor new project template. We've selected the directory where we want the source code to be stored, create, and now we need to configure. So we want a Blazor application. We want the latest version of .NET, which is 8. And we want the render mode to be server only. This is not about the WebAssembly part. We're not going to look at the WebAssembly part at all. So just the server part of Blazor and the DevExpress controls for Blazor. Run wizard. We need to choose between the possible themes. There's 4 built-in themes: Blazing Berry, Blazing Dark, Purple, and Office White. And then you can use any of the many Bootstrap themes. Let's go with Office White. In settings, we can select the font size. I usually go with small. This time we're going to go with medium and create project. A solution was created, a project was created. Let's run the web application. So this is a web application with 3 pages. There's the home page, which is slash. Then there's slash counter, and then there's /weather. Let's look over the Razor source code. So components in ASP.NET Core speak means Blazor. Razor is the file extension. We have under pages, index, which is slash, and counter, which is /counter, and weather, which is /weather. Counter contains HTML code plus a private member variable, a private field. This .razor file gets translated into a C# class, which then gets compiled. So a class will be created with a name counter. We'll have private int current count equals 0 as a private field, and this will be a method on that class. And then there's this binding, where whenever the value of the local field, of the private field, changes, the HTML text that's inside of this div will change. And for that, we need the mode interactive server. The modes that we're interested in Blazor without WebAssembly is the default one, where inside the .razor files you just generate HTML file content, and then you're sending that just once to the client, which would be server-side rendering. And then there's this interactive server where the web client, the web browser, talks to the web server, keeps a live connection in such a way that the server can notify the web browser, hey, please update the text that's inside of this class because it has changed server side. Okay. This is just HTML content. And then there are two Blazor components. One is the DX button, which is this one, the button control from DevExpress Blazor. And the other one is this one, page title, which puts counter in the title in the web browser. There's on-click event implemented with a C# method, which just increments the field. In Visual Studio, we have auto-completion. Everything's compiled, so you get notified about syntax errors. A DLL is being generated, DX Blazor application 1.dll, which is the name of the CES proj. Okay, let's now look at the page that we're actually interested in, which is the first time we see the source code, Razor source code for a DxGrid. So the grid component in DevExpress Blazor is named DxGrid. Let's see what it does. Has a definition of columns and has a data source. The data source uses this DxGrid attribute data. It's bound. Again, when weather.razor is being compiled, weather.razor is being converted to C# source code, a weather class is going to be generated, and in there will be a private field and a protected async method. There's the method onInitialized, which runs the code when the page loads, and it has an async overload. So another method which is async and another one which is not async. This is one of the data that can be displayed in a DevExpress grid. So the possibilities are a list, an array, anything else that implements IEnumerable. Or you can have a ADO.NET data table or data, in general, a class that contains data. As an additional feature, this page also implements two paths, which is stream rendering true, which means that the first time the application loads, if forecasts for a millisecond is null, then the body of the page will contain the text loading. And then when the private field changes its value and is no longer null, the page is going to be partially re-rendered because the HTTP server will tell the HTTP client that okay, let's look at the class weather forecast. It's just a simplest DTO data transfer object or class with just properties and no methods. There's three properties which actually have storage, and one which is computed based on the values stored in the other three properties. So temperature Fahrenheit is in fact temperature degrees with the math around it applied. Okay, and this is an array of weather forecast which is generated by a function, a method. It's just populating with example data, not doing anything complicated such as connecting to the internet or using a database storage on the hard disk. It's using random and English words for summary. Let's see how this looks like and how it behaves as a web application. This is how the DevExpress DxGrid looks like at one of its minimum minimorum configurations. The grid is read-only in the sense that you cannot edit the value that's on the first row, for instance, or you cannot add more rows. And also the number of lines that you can see where the DxGrid is defined. The DxGrid has a minimum number of attributes and only some columns defined. We did not specify edit forms, we did not specify search field, we did not specify the filter row, multi-column pre-defined grouping or predefined sorting. Sorting is enabled by default, but no, there is no sorting applied when the grid starts. You can apply sorting by clicking on one of the column headers, ascending and descending, and with Control click you remove the sorting. So click, click, and Control click. You cannot resize the columns. You cannot edit the rows. You cannot edit the fields. You cannot choose how many items will be displayed per page. The paginator is shown by default because there's more rows that can be shown on the first page. And additional functionalities which exist on the DxGrid are not being displayed by default. But you can, adding more source code to the Razor page, you can make some of these built-in functionalities visible. Okay, so the DxGrid has binding to this field, and we should define a list of columns for all DevExpress DxGrids. The most important, so inside the columns enum, we have the columns list, we have DxGrid data columns. The most important attribute here is field name, which specifies that the first column will show this property. You probably cannot use C# fields. You probably must use C# properties. Okay, the second column that's being displayed is the second public property. The third public property we can see by field name, and the fourth one. And then if you don't like the default captions, which are going to be date, temperature, sea temperature, F, and summary, you can change them using the caption attribute. And because this string is being displayed to the user, you might also translate this string. So use an internationalization C# framework in order to get the correct translation of this string when you're displaying the web application. Okay. In addition to this very basic grid, I have created a web application that has two more types of grids. We have a read-only grid, which looks like this. We have an unknown number of columns. We're using Razor syntax. This gets turned into C# source code. The DevExpress grid is bound both such that the C# source code can act on the grid with this private property or internal property. And also DevExpress grid, DxGrid, knows where to take the data from this private field. This time is not an IEnumerable list array, but instead it's a ADO.NET system.data.data table. We get the list of DxGrid data columns from the actual data table, from the columns inside of the data table. And additionally, we have some buttons exposed in the toolbar of the DevExpress DxGrid. We have a button which says fit column width, which has this on-click event, another button which says select columns, which uses this event implementation, and export to 3 type formats. Let's see how it looks like. Let's, I don't know, put a breakpoint here, if that works. And also here. Okay, /queries. We need to select an SQL query. Let's go with the simplest one. Select everything from the employee table. We can open a new tab if we want or not. And we're on the onInitialized or onInitialized async method, which gets called when the page needs to be displayed. We have a EF core DB context, and we're getting the data table from an MS SQL server. The data table looks like this. So there's the column ID with unique identifier, globally unique ID, first name, last name, start date, salary in dollars, is working remotely, phone number, and email addresses, which is a list separated with a comma. There's 0 columns yet in the DevExpress grid. So let's see how they are created. Which was this one. The ID column, so the primary key, global unique ID. Let's put a breakpoint at the end of the block. And then for first name, last name, start date, etc. The layout of the DxGrid is pretty basic in the sense that the DxGrid is allowed to use its defaults. It will show columns of type MS SQL bit, so a Boolean type, as checkboxes. It will display the salary as an integer with dot separator. Additionally, from the weather example, the query, let's see them side by side, has the following features enabled. We have the page size combo box chooser, which is not available by default in the weather DxGrid. We have buttons to select the columns that we want to display. And we can also change the order of the columns in here. And we can resize columns. And there's this button, fit column width. The filter row is being displayed. Let's use the filter row to select all of the employees that have a J in the last name. Press enter. Close the filter. There's this selector for filtering dates. And there's what existed also in the weather grid, which is the sort and removing the sort. Okay, so that's about it. More DxGrid features are being surfaced to the user, and the data is not fetched from an IEnumerable of a C# class, but instead it's loaded as needed from a data table. We are also using a DxGrid in order to present these three of SQL queries. We have the SQL query, we have a name for the query, a display name, and then we have another column which is not visible in here, which is this first column, which is category. The DxGrid is pre-grouped by this first column category. And you specify that with the attribute group index. Let's see what actually is inside one query. So there's a category name, a query MD5 sum, a query name, so this would be the display name, and a query MS-SQL query. So the query for the Microsoft SQL Server database. We're using the column category name. In here for the grouping, so it says category colon and then one all records. So this is the actual content of the field category underscore name. And then the content of the field one query underscore name is this employees is stored in this public property. And then the final DxGrid column is the content of this public property query underscore SQL query. Okay, so the text in the content of this cell is just what's inside the public property, whereas what's inside this cell is completely custom. We're using the DevExpress cell display template, which says, hey DevExpress, when rendering this cell, ignore whatever you do by default and instead render this thing. We prepare a C# string which contains an HTML-A, and then we're converting that thing to this Blazor markup, so HTML snippet. We have a IEnumerable of one query named data source as the source for the grid, so the attribute data of DxGrid. It's just a constant list. And now let's go to the most complex grid that we have in this example of source code that I wrote, which is the read-write employee, which has, additionally to the buttons that are available in an individual query, so there we had feed column widths, select columns, and export. In here we also have the add, delete, and edit buttons, so we want CRUD operations on this MS-SQL table. So this is the URL /read-write employees, RW employees. we're using a EF Core, Entity Framework Core DB context. And the DevExpress Grid, DxGrid, has most of the source code from the read-only queries, the read-only DxGrids that we had in this Visual Studio project, but with way more features enabled. So let's see what are the additions. In the toolbar, we have additionally buttons for add, edit, and delete. The edit and delete button get enabled only when the edit form is actually shown. No, only when there exists at least one row in the database with these edit items enabled. Then we have the classic fit column with select columns export. The columns array of DxGrid is extremely simple. We have a type. Let's see which one. So data. It's an enumerable of object, which is actually an employee. This is a C# class created from the MS-SQL table. So I have created the MS-SQL database, the MS-SQL table, and then using EF Core scaffolder, I have created the C# source code. We have a different DLL, Visual Studio project, for the scaffolded source code. The way we generate the C# source code is following these steps. So we need a C# project. There we need to add 3 NuGet packages: Microsoft.entityframework.core.sql server. So these are from EF Core. 3 NuGet packages: SQL Server, Design, and Tools. Then you need to build the project. You need to set it as startup project, and then you go to the NuGet package manager in the tools menu, and then package manager console. And in here, you make sure that the default project is selected, one that you want, which is storage, and just run this command line. Scaffold DB context, the SQL connection string, and then Microsoft.entityframework.core.sql server, and 2 directories: data for the database context, models for the C# classes that are generated, one per each data table in MS-SQL, and then the fact that we want data annotations to be used on the model classes. Let's see how this thing looks like. This is how the DB context is being generated. Nothing interesting in here. The most important part is this one, where it says that this database context knows how to work with just one MS-SQL database table, the one for employees. And then the employee class, which is generated based on the table employee, says in here the table name, says that the first column in the table is named ID, is of type unique ID in MS SQL, GUID in C#, the fact that it's a primary key in the MS SQL database, the fact that some fields are string nullables, so nvarchar of 50 nullable in this case for phone, and nvarchar of max and nullable in the case of email addresses, and nvarchar max but not nullable in the case of first name and last name. So we can see that because we have the question mark for nullable reference types, and we have the attributes on the individual properties, such as this one, where the length of the nvarchar column type is being stored. Okay, where are we now? There's the onInitialized async method, which actually goes to the database and fetches from there this thing, which is the IEnumerable of objects, in fact, IEnumerable of type employee, which just calls the DB context employees to list async. So this has been automatically generated for us. Okay. So let's see some of the features. We have columns representing one of the fields on one of the columns in the MS SQL database table. First name, last name, start date, salary, USDs, working remotely, phone, email addresses. We have changed for the caption that's displayed in the DevExpress heading. So first name with a space and lowercase n. So there's user readable, human readable text in the grids heading row. Okay, then additionally we have support for write. So we want to do CRUD operation, CRUID, create, read, update, delete on the MS SQL tables rows. And for that, we're using a edit form template, which is part of the DevExpress grid. This one can be displayed after the current row that we're editing inside of the grid, or could be a pop-up floating window. Let's see what type are we using. Edit mode, grid edit mode, pop-up edit form. So it will be a pop-up. Okay, we're using just basic editors. We've not customized them at all, which we need to do. When we have fields of type combo box in the MS SQL database, you'll need to put in here a combo box. You need to pre-compute the values that you need to display in the combo box, the current index, and if the index changes and you're saving the current row, you need to convert from the combo box to an enum and then probably to an int if you have integers in the MS SQL column. Also for start date, you want not an editor for text, but an editor for a data picker. Let's see how this actually looks like. We need to set the web application as the startup project and start. Read-write employees. We're going to select the first row. It's already selected for us. And then we go edit. This is how DX form layouts look like. They're responsive in the sense that they will look in a certain way on desktop computers with narrow web browsers, on mobile phones, etc. This editor, if it doesn't have enough room for 2 columns, will show 1 column. Like this. So the adaptability to different resolutions and DPIs and mobile phone versus desktop computer form factors is handled automatically for us by DevExpress. Okay. In here we said that start date should be replaced with a better editor. I have implemented the action that double-clicking on a row will edit the row. So this start date is shown as a string editor, so you should instead use a DevExpress date picker. It knew to put a combo box for MS SQL columns of type bit, which are type boolean in C#. And for integers, it provides up and down spinner buttons. There's also validation. Let's go cancel. We can add a new row. We can delete a row. And the delete confirmation text is custom because I think that there's less chances that the wrong row gets deleted if the confirmation message box actually says what's going to be deleted. Deleting rows in databases can be a real problem. If you're deleting the wrong row, how you're going to recreate that row from scratch? Did you happen to memorize what were the values in that row that you're going to just delete by accident? I think that showing some relevant text, which is part of the row that you're going to delete, is important in the confirmation pop-up message box. So that's done using a DevExpress pop-up, DX pop-up, with 2 DX buttons for delete and cancel. One is primary, the other one is secondary. And we're displaying the message box text. We have this text that's relevant for the currently selected row. Let's see how this thing is implemented. So it's a data binding, and when the user clicks on the delete button, we compute the row that we're going to delete. We have a focused row visible index. So when the DevExpress grid might only show 5 rows from an MS SQL database, which has 5,000 rows. This returns, 4, which is the index which is visible in the DevExpress grid. And then there's this method which actually gets you the row that you have currently selected, which is the object instance from this enumerable, which is the data that's behind the DxGrid. And then we're just concatenating the first name and a space and a last name. There's built-in methods inside the DxGrid for show column chooser, export to XLS X async, export to CSV async. We're handling the deleting from the MS SQL database by ourselves using the methods provided by EF Core, pre-generated for us by the scaffolder. The delete confirmation yes button and no button show this, set this member variable, which is bound to actually displaying or not the DevExpress pop-up. Let's see how that is done. DX pop-up at bind minus visible. So this pop-up is visible only when confirmation shown is true, and this is a Boolean internal property. Okay, so now we know how this button is implemented with the custom DX pop-up and DX buttons. The edit is using built-in functionality in DxGrid. Add the same thing. So add is just a special case of edit. The functionality that you need to define in Razor for editing will be also used for adding. This is the add or edit form that's being shown. These are the list of columns in the DxGrid. And these are the 6+2 buttons in the DxGrid toolbar. And we also have resizable columns and fit column width. Resizable columns is enabled in here. In this column resize mode. And this row, which doesn't look that great, it's not evident that is used for filtering, should have been colored in a different way, or should have, should be grayed out or something. It makes you think that this is the first row with data, but no, the first row with data is this one with Albert. This is the DxGrid heading, the columns display names, and this is the first row. This is the filter row. Which is enabled using this attribute of DxGrid, show filter row equals true. Let's see what new toolbar click does. It's just using DxGrid built-in functions. Start, edit, new row async. The keyword being new in here. And then start, edit, row async without new. Let's look a bit at the installed DevExpress Grid demo. So again, the DevExpress demo application, Blazor, and the grid. And what we have here is all of the DevExpress Blazor controls that are installed on this computer. We also have reports and data editors. The data editors are reused by the DevExpress Grid. It's really hard to use just the DevExpress Grid without all of the other DevExpress Blazor controls. So data grid is marked as maintenance. This is another type. It's not DxGrid. It's actually named DX data grid. So not DxGrid, but DX data grid, and data extra. This is the old way of doing things, but if a functionality is not yet implemented in DxGrid and you're in a hurry, you cannot wait for years for the missing feature to be added to DxGrid and you just cannot implement it yourself, then maybe the thing to do is to convert your existing source code that you have that uses DxGrid to use DxDataGrid, and maybe the functionality that you want can be implemented this way. You should go through the demos applications. There's this application, and then there are also a number of knowledge base articles on the DevExpress website. And also DevExpress has many projects on GitHub with samples and demos for various scenarios. There's a sample for binding MSSQL, not MSSQL, but entity framework with DevExpress Grid, and a demo for editing data, a demo for having very custom context menu on a DxGrid row, etc. Do search them on Google and you would either find the DevExpress knowledge base article or straight the DevExpress GitHub repository, and probably the DevExpress knowledge base article will also send you to the DevExpress GitHub page. Okay, so let's ignore DX data grid and go to our grid. Let's go from bottom to top this time. You don't really know what DxGrid is capable of. So when preparing the specifications for your web application, do look at the demos and see what's possible, and build your specifications around what you have seen that's already possible with DevExpress Grid if your application is built around DxGrid. Don't try to go extremely custom with your implementation on top of DxGrid. Try to use as much as possible the way that DxGrid works out of the box. So it's really important to have seen all of the possible demos in order to know the full set of functionalities that's available with DxGrid. So virtual means a huge list of data. Maybe it's fetched from a huge database, maybe it's fetched from over the internet, maybe it's generated randomly, locally in memory. We can see the placeholders when we scroll. we have these rounded rectangles gray. There's this enable text wrap attribute for the DxGrid. In here it's showing ellipses. In here it's using more than one line. Virtual scrolling enabled. Okay, paging. Paging is probably about this functionality where it shows the current page that we're on. The fact that we can jump straight to the page 4, press enter. We can go to the last, first, previous, next page, and the number of rows that that are shown on the page. You can choose a default value, and what's displayed in the combo box you can also define. You need to make sure that you don't display the combo box item all if you have a huge amount of rows. That's just going to be a way for the end user to create issues and bugs. In here we select the items that are going to be in the paginator. So we have 10, 20, 100. These are a list. And then we say page size selector all rows item visible true. So that's the last item in the combo box, the one that has the text all. So this is a DxGrid attribute, and this first three is another DxGrid attribute. Page size selector items and page size selector all rows items visible. For various columns, you can have the minimum width in pixels, a width in percent, combination of width in percent and minimum width in pixels. In here, the data storage behind DxGrid is a enumerable of a C# class, which looks as we would expect, a ton of public properties. Partial classes are very popular for models. The classes that are generated by the EF core scaffolder also are partial. So this way you can use the scaffolder to create the skeleton of the classes. You can have just the properties that have columns in the SQL table. And then you can, for instance, add additional properties to the employee class using a second partial class employee, where you put, for instance, just the properties that are computed from the properties that have actual columns in the database. So all sorts of functionality that has predefined values in DxGrid might have a way of customizing it. For instance, the pager position is this page size combo box is at the bottom, but it says there's a way of customizing it with pager position, grid pager position, top and bottom. So it's not just shown in the bottom right, but also in the bottom top. And the same for the paginator. The DxGrid has a toolbar, which we saw. We only had buttons which are text only. This is how you have buttons which also have icons. And in this case, the buttons do not have a 1 pixel outline around them. In using this value, DX toolbar item render style mode toolbar render style mode plain. This is the way you specify the CSS class for each DX toolbar item such that you can display the icon. There's built-in icons, and you can also download fonts with containing just the icons that you actually need. And you can also download SVG files for the icon. Okay, the rest is what we would expect. Customization. Every second row should be a different background color. Let's see how that is implemented. We have columns, DxGrid data column, and customize element, grid customize element. Let's see what that thing does. Says that if the visible index, so the visible index says look at the DxGrid only at the rows that are currently displayed on the screen, and there the few rows that are displayed on the screen will have the indexes that you would expect, so visible index starting from 0. And in here it's computing if it's odd. So odd means, for instance, the index is 1, which means the second row. So 1 modulo 2 is 1, and that's equal to 1. So that means it's an odd row, so it's actually an even row because the row with index 1 is the second row. And it's using a class, a CSS class for a different background. You can have conditional styling in the sense that you can have what HTML you want in a cell. For instance, you can have HTML-A anchors, you can have bold, you can have divs, P, paragraphs, etc. Customize element, grid customize element. And in here we can also see that it's grouped by country, which means there's a column named country. And there's a group summary with count and sum. Export to XLSX, which is the newer format from Excel, the older format from Excel, comma separated values. And we also have export to PDF. Exporting to PDF actually takes the data that's behind the DevExpress grid, generates a DevExpress report, and then exports that report to PDF file. You can have functionality where if the user configures the DxGrid, such as changing the grouping or the sorting or maybe the size of cells, etc., there's a way of storing the changes made by the user. This is column resize. We had that. This is auto fit. We had that. This is the column chooser. We have this in the source code, the application that I have created, the sample one. Similar to Microsoft Excel, you can have rows that if you scroll left, right, will always be visible. In this case, company name, city, and whatever this first column is. It says fixed position left, fixed position left, and then there's this city, which is bound to this, whatever this thing is, a internal property with getter only. So get only internal property. This is probably the column template. Let's see what this thing is about. So on the column, click a link below to show more information about an employee. So there's tooltips for the column headers. There's this possibility of having tooltips. With header caption template. We saw this one, cell display template, where you can either have a C# method that does this thing, or you could use Razor plus Blazor syntax. As in this case, they're not implementing a C# method, they're just writing everything in line. Grid in grid. Preview after each of the rows. Detail row template. Focused row. I'm not even sure what this thing is, probably multi-row selection. Using control click. Select a column. How do we select a column? Okay, then at the bottom of the grid, we can have computed labels. For instance, count, average, max, mean, sum, etc. Which is done with the total summary member of DxGrid. There's predefined functions, maths. Mean, average, max, sum. some after total summary or a grouping. And in here it's displayed in a footer. Filter row, this row in here, we had this thing. So search box is this filter edit box, which searches in all columns. And after a number of seconds, it searches automatically. You don't have to press the enter key. Delete button. This menu. The way of editing data with an edit form, with a pop-up edit form. This is a command column. Let's see how that is implemented. DxGrid command column. This is the built-in way of editing a row with the buttons new shown in the heading, and then on each of the rows there's edit and delete buttons. When you go edit and the edit form is not pop-up, and the editor is inline, you can have a cancel button there. I'm not sure where. Okay, this is more advanced and a easier way to edit more rows faster. So maybe you want to edit 20 rows in 2 seconds, then you would not want to display an edit form. You would want to use either edit cell or edit row. Probably edit cell. Like this. I'm not sure why grouping is popular. I don't use grouping. I've used it in the queries grid where I needed to use DxGrid for showing a tree view. Sorting is enabled by default, and you can specify the column that's sorted by default with this sort index equals 0. So when the DxGrid is shown, displayed the first time, it's going to be pre-sorted ascending by this field. Data binding, you do it with the data attribute of DxGrid. Just make sure that it's a list or an enumerable or a data table. Asynchronous data binding. What do they mean by that? I'm not sure why it's saying asynchronous data binding, because it's just using onInitialize the sync instead of onInitialized. Okay, what's this observable thing? So says that DxGrid is backed by grid data. And grid data is an observable collection, whatever this thing is. Customize element. Apply stock changes. I'm not sure what this thing is. Probably just using a data binding is not enough. If you change the source on server side of the data that's backing the data, the DxGrid, maybe the DxGrid will not know to tell the web client to refresh the grid because observable is not implemented for the IEnumerable. So when changing the IEnumerable, the DxGrid will not be notified. Something like this. On in the method onInitialized or onInitialize the thing, you can have any source code that you want. You can load data from the hard disk, from a network resource, etc. And then unbound columns. So object data, which is what? Data equals invoices ordered by return new. What's that? Invoice probably. Probably, I know, final discount is not a field that exists on the C# class that's in the IEnumerable that's backing the DxGrid. So it's just computed based on the other columns in the DxGrid. Unbound type decimal, unbound type decimal, and unbound expression. And final discount is what? Read unbound column data event. Marks. I don't know, maybe it's fetching data from DxGrid to compute data for other rows in the DxGrid or for the current row. Okay, so this is it. This is how you use a very important DevExpress Blazor control, DevExpress DxGrid. If your web application is built around .NET 8 and EF Core and DevExpress Blazor and is a ASP.NET Core Blazor app, then you probably will need DxGrid. Thank you.